They tried to erase the Harpe family from history. Every record was burned, every witness silenced, every trace of their existence carefully removed from courthouse documents, newspaper archives, and family Bibles across 3 states. But you cannot destroy a legacy of horror that soaked into the very soil of the Appalachian Mountains. You cannot bury truth deep enough when it leaves scars on an entire region's soul. What you're about to learn was meant to stay buried in the hollers and ridges where civilization fears to tread. The authorities decided long ago that some stories are too dangerous to tell, some families too monstrous to remember, some truths too terrible for the history books. But the truth has a way of bleeding through the cracks. In the summer of 1797, travelers began disappearing along the Wilderness Road. Not just 1 or 2 unfortunate souls lost to bandits or wild animals. Entire families vanished without trace. Wagons found overturned, their contents scattered, but no bodies. No survivors, no witnesses, just empty vessels and the lingering smell of something wrong carried on the mountain wind. The local authorities attributed these disappearances to the usual dangers of frontier life. Indian raids, they said, wild animals, accidents, natural causes. They had no idea they were dealing with something far worse than anything nature could produce. They had no idea that evil itself had taken root in the Kentucky wilderness, wearing human faces and walking upright through their communities. Micajah Harpe stood 6 feet tall, with wild black hair that hung past his shoulders and eyes the color of old blood. His younger brother Wiley was shorter but no less terrifying, his pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, his smile a slash of yellowed teeth that never reached his dead eyes. They called themselves Big Harpe and Little Harpe, though their given names appear in no official records that survive today. Even their birth certificates, if they ever existed, have been systematically destroyed. What we know comes from fragments. Testimonies given in trembling whispers before witnesses died under mysterious circumstances. Court documents that survived only because they were misfiled in distant counties. The desperate final letters of frontier judges who tried to bring justice to the mountains and paid for their efforts with their lives. The Harpe brothers weren't ordinary criminals. They weren't driven by greed or desperation or any human motivation that civilized minds could comprehend. They killed for pleasure. They tortured for entertainment. They collected human suffering the way other men collected coins or furs. And they did it all with the methodical precision of men who had turned murder into an art form. Their first documented victims were the Trisward family, traveling from Virginia to settle new land in Kentucky. Samuel Trisward, his wife Martha, and their 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9. The family was found 2 days after they failed to arrive at Fort Boonesborough, their bodies arranged in a pattern that defied explanation. The children had been killed first, slowly, while their parents watched. Samuel Trisward's body showed evidence of torture that lasted hours. Martha had been kept alive longest of all. But it was what the killers did afterward that marked this as something beyond ordinary frontier violence. The bodies had been positioned deliberately, arranged, displayed, as if the murderers wanted to send a message to anyone who might find them, as if they took pride in their work. The local sheriff, a man named William Steele, who had seen his share of violence on the frontier, wrote in his official report that the scene bore the marks of devils walking among us in human form. He recommended that no details be shared with the families of the victims. Some knowledge, he wrote, was too heavy for Christian souls to bear. Sheriff Steele would be dead within 6 months, found floating face down in the Kentucky River with his throat cut. His killer was never found. The pattern continued through the fall of 1797. The Langford family, the Dooleys, the Robertsons, always traveling families. Always on isolated stretches of road. Always tortured and arranged in ways that suggested ritual purpose rather than random violence. The authorities began to suspect they were dealing with something organized, something planned. What they didn't understand was that they were dealing with something that had been planned for years. The Harpe brothers hadn't simply decided to become killers one day. They had been shaped for it, molded, created. Their childhood in the mountains of North Carolina was a horror story in itself, though most of the details died with the few people who witnessed it. What survived were glimpses, fragments of testimony from neighbors who fled the region and never spoke openly about what they had seen. Their father, a man known only as Old Harpe, ran what he called a trading post in the deepest part of the Carolina mountains. But he wasn't trading furs or tools or supplies. He was trading in human misery. Children who went missing from frontier settlements, women who vanished while traveling alone, men who disappeared and were never seen again. All of them ended up at the Harpe compound, where Old Harpe conducted what he called his experiments. The exact nature of these experiments died with him, but witnesses described screams that echoed through the mountains for days at a time, sounds that weren't quite human anymore, smells that made strong men vomit and women faint, and the Harpe brothers, even as children, watching and learning and absorbing lessons that no human being should ever know. When Makaja turned 16 and Wiley 14, they killed their father, not out of rebellion or hatred, but as graduation, the final test. They had learned everything he could teach them, and they no longer needed him. They burned the compound to the ground and headed west, carrying with them knowledge that should have died in that fire. But knowledge like that doesn't die. It spreads. It grows. It finds new ways to express itself in the world. By the time they reached Kentucky, the Harpe brothers had perfected their craft. They knew how to choose victims who wouldn't be missed quickly. They knew which roads were least traveled, which settlements were most isolated. They knew how to move through the wilderness without leaving tracks, how to disappear into the mountains when pursuit grew too close. Most importantly, they knew how to make people disappear without leaving evidence that could connect back to them. They weren't working alone. This is the part of the story that the authorities tried hardest to suppress. The part that threatened not just individual safety, but the entire structure of frontier society. The Harpe brothers had allies, supporters, people in positions of authority who protected them and covered their tracks and ensured that investigations led nowhere. Judge Cornelius Bradford of Harrodsburg was one of them. A respected member of the community, a pillar of frontier society, a man who had helped write the laws that governed Kentucky territory. He was also secretly funding the Harpe brothers' activities and providing them with information about traveling families who carried valuables worth taking. Bradford's connection to the Harpers was discovered by accident in the spring of 1798, when a courier carrying legal documents was ambushed on the road between Harrodsburg and Lexington. The man survived the attack, though he was left permanently disfigured, and he identified one of his attackers as Little Harpe. When authorities searched Bradford's offices, they found detailed records of every family that had been murdered, along with inventories of their possessions and notes about which items had been sold and where. Bradford was arrested, but he never stood trial. He was found dead in his jail cell 3 days later, his body showing signs of strangulation. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, though the cell had been locked from the outside, and the rope around his neck was tied with a knot that required 2 people to achieve. The jailer claimed he had seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. He left Kentucky 2 weeks later and was never seen again. Bradford's records were confiscated and supposedly destroyed, but copies survived, hidden in the walls of the courthouse, buried in unmarked graves, passed down through families who were too terrified to speak openly about what they contained. These documents revealed the true scope of what the Harpe brothers had been doing. They weren't just killing randomly, they were operating a business. A systematic enterprise that combined murder, robbery, and human trafficking on a scale that the frontier had never seen. They had customers, regular clients who paid premium prices for specific types of victims, wealthy plantation owners who wanted exotic entertainment for their guests, riverboat captains who needed slaves who couldn't be traced back to legitimate sales, military contractors who required test subjects for medical experiments that no ethical doctor would perform. The Harpe brothers were suppliers in a marketplace that existed in the shadows of American society. They provided human raw material for people whose appetites ran to things that civilized society couldn't accommodate. And they did it all with the protection of officials who were either bought off, blackmailed, or secretly participating in the same activities. This network stretched from the Carolina Mountains to the Mississippi River. It included judges and sheriffs and military officers and prominent merchants. It had its own communication system, its own methods of transportation, its own codes and signals that allowed members to identify each other without risk of exposure to outsiders. It was, in effect, a shadow government that operated parallel to the legitimate authorities and often controlled them through fear and corruption. The Harpe brothers were just the enforcement arm of this organization, the visible face of something much larger and more terrible than anyone imagined. But they were also its weak point. Because unlike their superiors, who operated from positions of respectability and maintained careful facades of civilization, the Harpe brothers couldn't help themselves. They enjoyed their work too much. They took too many risks. They left too many clues. They attracted too much attention. In the summer of 1798, they made their first serious mistake. Moses Stegall was a settler who lived alone in a cabin near the Green River. He had a reputation as a man who minded his own business and caused no trouble for anyone. He also had a reputation as someone who knew things. Someone who had been places and seen things and accumulated knowledge that certain people found valuable. What Stegall knew was the location of several mass graves where the Harpe brothers had disposed of bodies over the past year. He had stumbled across them while hunting, and had been smart enough to mark their locations without disturbing them. He planned to report his findings to the authorities when he could be sure of contacting someone who wasn't part of the conspiracy. The Harpe brothers learned about Stegall's knowledge through their network of informants. They were ordered to eliminate him before he could share what he knew. It should have been a simple job. One man, living alone, no close neighbors, no one who would miss him immediately. But Stegall wasn't alone when they arrived at his cabin that night. He was hosting a Methodist preacher named William Lambeth, who was traveling through the region holding revival meetings. Lambeth had arrived unexpectedly, and Stegall had offered him shelter for the night, as frontier hospitality demanded. The presence of a witness should have changed the brothers' plans. They should have waited for another opportunity. They should have been patient and careful and methodical, as they had always been before. Instead, they killed them both. But Preacher Lambeth didn't die quietly. He fought back. He screamed. He made enough noise to wake Stegall's nearest neighbor, a man named Daniel Boone. Yes, that Daniel Boone. The same legendary frontiersman whose name was already becoming synonymous with Kentucky wilderness. And Boone was not a man who ignored sounds of trouble in the night. Boone arrived at Steggall's cabin just as the Harpe brothers were finishing their work. He saw them. He recognized them. He knew immediately what he was dealing with because he had been tracking rumors about the brothers for months, trying to piece together a pattern that others had missed or chosen to ignore. The brothers saw Boone and knew they had a problem. They couldn't kill him without bringing down the entire weight of frontier society on their heads. Boone was too famous, too respected, too connected to eliminate quietly, but they also couldn't let him live with what he had witnessed. So they tried to recruit him. Little Harpe approached Boone with an offer. Join the organization, become part of the network, share in the profits, keep the secrets. Live comfortably and safely under the protection of people who controlled more power than Boone could imagine. Boone's response was to put a rifle ball through Little Harpe's shoulder and chase both brothers into the woods with a tomahawk. This was the moment when everything changed. When the Harpe brothers went from being protected assets to dangerous liabilities, when their superiors realized that the brothers' appetite for violence had grown beyond their ability to control or conceal it. Within days, bounty hunters were scouring the mountains for the Harpe brothers. Not lawmen working for the territorial government, but private contractors working for people who wanted the brothers eliminated before they could be captured and questioned. The same network that had protected them now wanted them dead. But the Harpe brothers had learned too much about survival in their years of hunting others. They knew how to disappear. They knew how to live off the land without leaving traces. They knew which caves provided shelter and which streams could hide their tracks and which mountain passes were too dangerous for pursuit. They stayed hidden through the winter of 1798, but they didn't stay inactive. If their former allies wanted them dead, they would give those allies something to really worry about. They would show them what happened when you tried to discard the Harpe brothers like broken tools. They began systematically hunting down everyone who had been part of their network. Judge Bradford was already dead, but there were others. Sheriff Thomas Henderson of Nelson County, who had provided the brothers with information about travelers carrying large amounts of money. Henderson was found in his office with his throat cut and a list of names pinned to his chest with a hunting knife. Every name on the list was someone who had been involved in the conspiracy. Captain James Morrison of the Kentucky militia, who had supplied the brothers with military weapons and ammunition. Morrison disappeared while riding between Lexington and Frankfort. His horse was found 3 days later with Morrison's scalp tied to the saddle. His body was never recovered. Merchant William Steele of Bardstown, who had served as a fence for goods stolen from murder victims. Steele was discovered in his shop, tied to a chair, showing evidence of prolonged torture. A sign hung around his neck reading, "This is what happens to traitors." One by one, the members of the network were eliminated. Some disappeared entirely. Others were found mutilated in ways that sent clear messages to anyone else who might be tempted to betray the brothers. The surviving members of the conspiracy began to panic. They reached out to federal authorities, offering to reveal everything they knew in exchange for protection. But the federal government had problems of its own. The conspiracy had tentacles that reached into the highest levels of territorial administration. Revealing the full scope would have destroyed public confidence in frontier governance and potentially triggered widespread uprising against federal authority. The decision was made at the highest levels to contain the situation rather than expose it. A special unit was formed, operating outside normal military and civilian channels. Its mission was simple: find the Harpe brothers and kill them. No trials, no testimony, no public revelation of what they knew or who they had worked with. Just elimination, quick and quiet and final. The unit was led by Captain James Davis, a man with experience in what would later be called black operations. Davis had served in the Revolution, but not in any battles that appeared in official records. He had spent his war years conducting activities that the Continental Congress preferred not to acknowledge. Activities that involved the systematic elimination of people who posed threats to the revolutionary cause. Davis assembled a team of men with similar backgrounds. Veterans of undeclared wars and unofficial conflicts. Men who understood that some enemies were too dangerous to capture and some secrets too sensitive to reveal. Men who could kill without leaving evidence and disappear without leaving traces. They hunted the Harpe brothers for 6 months, using techniques that had been developed during the Revolution and refined in conflicts that never appeared in history books. They tracked them through the Cumberland Gap into Tennessee. They followed them north into southern Illinois. They cornered them twice and lost them both times, but each encounter provided new intelligence about the brothers, capabilities, and weaknesses. The final confrontation came in August of 1799, near the confluence of the Green and Ohio rivers. Davis and his team had tracked the brothers to a cave system that the Harpies had been using as a base of operations. Intelligence suggested that the brothers had been meeting with representatives from other criminal organizations, trying to rebuild their network and expand their operations into new territories. The attack came at dawn. Davis and his men sealed most of the cave entrances with explosives, then stormed the main opening. The battle lasted 3 hours and cost the lives of 4 of Davis's men, but when it was over, Micajah Harpe was dead and Wiley Harpe was mortally wounded. What happened next was never recorded in any official report. According to witnesses who were sworn to secrecy but whose testimony survived in family papers discovered centuries later, Captain Davis questioned Wiley Harpe extensively before allowing him to die. The interrogation lasted several hours and covered not just the brothers, activities in Kentucky and Tennessee, but their entire network of contacts and supporters. Harpe revealed everything: names, locations, methods, connections. He described a conspiracy that reached from frontier settlements to major cities along the eastern seaboard. He detailed operations that involved not just murder and robbery, but human trafficking, political assassination, and activities that bordered on treason against the United States. Most importantly, he revealed that the network was still active. The elimination of the Harpe brothers would not end it. Other operatives were already in place to continue the work. Other territories were being targeted for expansion. Other officials were being corrupted or blackmailed into cooperation. When Harpe finished talking, Davis put a pistol to his head and ended his life. Then Davis made a decision that changed the course of American history. Instead of reporting Harpe's revelations to his superiors, Davis destroyed all evidence of what he had learned. He falsified his mission report, claiming that the brothers had died in the initial assault and revealing nothing about the interrogation or the conspiracy it had exposed. He disbanded his unit and sent his surviving men to different regions of the country with orders never to speak about what they had witnessed. Davis himself disappeared into the Tennessee mountains and was never seen again. Why did he do it? The answer lies in a letter he wrote to his wife before vanishing, a letter that wasn't discovered until 1847, when workers demolishing an old house in Nashville found it hidden in a wall cavity. In the letter, Davis explained that the conspiracy Harpe had described was too powerful to fight and too dangerous to expose. Attempting to reveal it would result in the assassination of everyone involved in the investigation, including Davis himself and his family. More importantly, the revelation would destroy public faith in American institutions at a time when the young nation was still fragile and vulnerable to collapse. Davis made the decision to bury the truth, rather than risk the destruction of the United States. He chose to allow the conspiracy to continue, rather than trigger a crisis that might tear the country apart. In his words, "Some evils are too great to cure. Sometimes the best you can do is contain them and hope that time will find a better solution." The official story was that the Harpe brothers had been killed while resisting arrest. Their bodies were publicly displayed as proof that frontier justice had prevailed over criminal violence. Rewards were paid to the men who had participated in their capture. The case was closed, and the frontier began to return to normal. But normal was an illusion. The network that had supported the Harpe brothers continued to operate. Without the brothers' visible violence to attract attention, it became more subtle and more dangerous. It evolved from crude frontier criminality into sophisticated organized crime that operated in major cities and had connections to legitimate businesses and political organizations. By 1805, the network had spread to New Orleans, where it became involved in the slave trade and political corruption that characterized the Louisiana Territory. By 1810, it had established operations in New York and Philadelphia, where it engaged in activities ranging from counterfeiting to political assassination. By 1815, it had connections to international criminal organizations operating out of Europe and the Caribbean. The Harpe brothers had been eliminated, but the system they represented had not just survived, it had grown stronger. And it was still growing in 1806, when this story was supposed to end. But stories like this never really end. They just go underground. They adapt. They find new faces and new methods and new territories to exploit. The evil that created the Harpe brothers didn't die with them. It just found new vessels to carry it forward. You need to understand something. The conspiracy that supported the Harpe brothers wasn't some primitive frontier organization that collapsed when law and order reached the Kentucky mountains. It was a prototype, a testing ground, a proof of concept for criminal enterprises that would eventually span continents and influence governments and control resources that most people couldn't imagine. The techniques pioneered by the Harpe network, systematic corruption of officials, coordination between criminal groups across vast distances, integration of legitimate and illegal activities, use of violence as both business tool and control mechanism, these became the foundation for organized crime as it exists today. Every major criminal organization in American history can trace its methods back to innovations developed by the people who created and supported the Harpe brothers, the mafia families of the early 20th century, the drug cartels of the modern era, the human trafficking networks that operate across international borders. They all use techniques that were first tested in the Kentucky wilderness more than 2 centuries ago. But there's something else you need to know. Something that makes this more than just a historical curiosity about frontier violence and the origins of organized crime. The network never really went away. Oh, it changed names and faces and methods. It adapted to new technologies and new social conditions and new legal frameworks. It learned to operate in the shadows of modern civilization rather than the wilderness of the frontier. But it never stopped operating. In 1823, a series of disappearances in western Pennsylvania showed patterns remarkably similar to the Harpe brothers' activities. Families traveling on remote roads. Bodies found arranged in deliberate patterns. Authorities who seemed unusually reluctant to investigate thoroughly. In 1841, similar incidents occurred in Missouri and Arkansas. Again, the same patterns, the same methods. The same official indifference to evidence that suggested organized rather than random violence. In 1859, just before the Civil War began, a network of criminal activities was uncovered that stretched from Texas to Virginia and showed clear organizational connections to the conspiracy that had supported the Harpe brothers. The investigation was abandoned when the war started, and the records were lost in the chaos that followed. But the most disturbing evidence came much later. In 1876, during the construction of a railroad through eastern Kentucky, workers discovered a series of caves that had been used as storage sites and meeting places. The caves contained artifacts and documents that dated back to the 1790s, but they also contained much more recent materials. Evidence of activities that had continued throughout the 19th century. Maps showing routes through multiple states. Lists of names and addresses in major cities. Financial records indicating transactions involving enormous sums of money. Communication systems that allowed coordination across thousands of miles. All of it suggesting that the network had not just survived, but had grown into something far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The railroad company reported the discovery to federal authorities, but the investigation was classified and the results were never made public. The caves were sealed with explosives and the area was declared off-limits to civilian access. The workers who had made the discovery were relocated to different regions and given new identities. But some of them talked, in letters to family members, in deathbed confessions, in testimonies that they left sealed with instructions that they not be opened for 50 years. What they described was evidence that the conspiracy had evolved into something that controlled significant portions of American commerce and politics. Something that had members in Congress and state governments and major corporations. Something that could make entire investigations disappear and ensure that certain stories never appeared in newspapers or history books. Something that was still active in 1876 and showed no signs of stopping. The trail goes cold after that. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because the activities became invisible doesn't mean they ended. Just because the methods became more sophisticated doesn't mean the goals changed. In 1923, FBI documents that were declassified decades later revealed investigations into criminal networks that showed organizational characteristics remarkably similar to the Harpe conspiracy. Multi-state operations involving corrupt officials, systematic violence, and integration with legitimate businesses. The investigations were terminated for national security reasons, and the agents involved were transferred to other duties. During World War II, military intelligence identified criminal organizations operating in the United States that appeared to have connections to enemy intelligence services. These organizations used methods and maintained structures that investigators compared to historical accounts of frontier criminal networks from the early 1800s. The investigations were classified and remain sealed to this day. In the 1960s, congressional investigations into organized crime uncovered evidence of criminal enterprises that had been operating continuously for more than a century, enterprises that maintained detailed records of their activities and showed clear organizational descent from much earlier criminal groups. The investigations were suspended when key witnesses began dying under mysterious circumstances. Each time investigators got close to exposing the full scope of what they were dealing with, the investigation was shut down, or the evidence disappeared, or the people involved met untimely ends. Each time the official explanation was that the investigation had reached a dead end, or that national security considerations required termination of the inquiry. But the pattern was always the same. Someone would discover evidence of criminal activities that seemed too large and too well organized to be random. Someone would begin to trace connections that led back through decades or centuries of similar activities. Someone would realize they were looking at something that had been operating continuously since the early days of American history. And then someone would make sure that the investigation ended and the investigators learned to ask different questions. This brings us to something uncomfortable. Something that challenges everything you think you know about American history and the nature of the society you live in. What if the Harpe brothers weren't just isolated criminals who got out of control? What if they were part of something that never went away? What if the network that created them and supported them and eventually sacrificed them continued to operate and grow and evolve until it became something that influences the world you live in today? What if the disappearances and murders and systematic violence that characterized their activities in the 1790s never really stopped? What if they just became more subtle and more carefully concealed and more skillfully integrated into the structures of modern society? What if some of the people who control major corporations and political organizations and law enforcement agencies are the organizational descendants of the people who created the Harpe brothers more than 2 centuries ago? What if the techniques pioneered in the Kentucky wilderness are still being used today, but on a scale and with a sophistication that would make the Harpe brothers look like primitive amateurs? These aren't idle speculations. These are questions that emerge when you follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how disturbing the implications might be. Consider the facts. A criminal network that began in the 1790s showed remarkable longevity and adaptability. It survived the elimination of its most visible operatives. It adapted to changing social and technological conditions. It maintained organizational continuity across multiple generations. It developed techniques for corrupting officials and controlling investigations and ensuring that its activities remained hidden from public view. Now consider the present day. Missing persons cases that follow patterns remarkably similar to those established by the Harpe brothers. Official investigations that reach dead ends, despite abundant evidence. Witnesses who disappear or die under suspicious circumstances. Media coverage that focuses on individual incidents rather than systematic patterns. Authorities who seem unusually reluctant to investigate certain types of crimes or pursue certain types of evidence. Consider the scope of modern organized crime. Criminal enterprises that operate across international boundaries. Networks that have infiltrated legitimate businesses and government agencies. Organizations that control resources worth billions of dollars and have the capability to influence elections and policy decisions and law enforcement activities. Consider the sophistication of modern criminal methods, technologies that allow instant communication across vast distances, financial systems that enable the movement of enormous sums of money without detection, transportation networks that facilitate the movement of people and goods without official oversight, legal structures that provide protection for criminal activities conducted under the cover of legitimate businesses. All of these capabilities existed in primitive form in the network that supported the Harpe brothers. The technology has advanced, but the fundamental methods remain the same. Corruption, violence, secrecy, integration with legitimate institutions, systematic elimination of threats. What if this isn't a coincidence? What if the similarity exists because the organizations are connected? What if modern organized crime didn't develop independently, but evolved directly from the criminal networks that operated in the early days of American history? What if the Harpe brothers were just the beginning? You have to understand, once you start asking these questions, you can't stop. Once you begin to see the patterns, you see them everywhere. Once you realize how long these organizations have been operating and how sophisticated their methods have become, you begin to understand how much of what you think you know about the world might be carefully constructed illusion. Every major historical event starts to look different when you consider the possibility that powerful criminal organizations have been influencing outcomes behind the scenes for more than 2 centuries. Every political decision, every economic crisis, every social movement begins to take on new significance when you realize that some of the people involved might be working for interests that have nothing to do with the public good. This is why the story of the Harpe brothers was buried. Not just because their individual crimes were too horrible to remember, but because their connections revealed something about American society that was too dangerous to acknowledge. Something that threatened the basic assumptions on which the country was built. The United States was supposed to be different from the corrupt old world that its founders had left behind. It was supposed to be a place where justice prevailed, and where ordinary people could trust their institutions, and where criminals couldn't buy protection from powerful people who operated above the law. But what if that was never true? What if the same types of criminal organizations that had operated in Europe for centuries simply followed the settlers to America and adapted their methods to frontier conditions? What if the Harpe brothers were working for people who had been controlling events from behind the scenes since before the country was founded? The implications are staggering. If criminal organizations have been operating continuously in America since the 1790s, if they've had 2 centuries to infiltrate institutions and accumulate resources and perfect their methods, then they would possess capabilities that most people couldn't imagine. They would have influence that extends into every aspect of American society. They would be able to control information, manipulate events, and eliminate threats with an efficiency that would make government agencies look like amateurs. They would, in effect, constitute a shadow government that operates parallel to official institutions and frequently controls them through methods that range from corruption to blackmail to assassination. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is pattern recognition. This is following evidence to its logical conclusions regardless of how uncomfortable those conclusions might be. The Harpe brothers killed people for profit and pleasure, but they were small-time operators compared to their modern successors. The network that created them has had more than 2 centuries to grow and evolve and perfect its techniques. It has access to technologies and resources that the Harpe brothers couldn't have imagined. It operates on a scale that makes their frontier activities look like children's games. And it's still operating. Every time investigators get close to exposing major criminal networks, the investigations are terminated, or the evidence disappears, or the investigators suffer fatal accidents. Every time journalists begin to uncover connections between organized crime and legitimate institutions, their stories are killed, or their sources are silenced, or their careers are destroyed. Every time ordinary citizens stumble across evidence of systematic criminal activity, they are discredited, or intimidated, or eliminated. This has been happening for more than 2 centuries. The methods have become more sophisticated, but the pattern remains the same. Powerful criminal organizations protect themselves by controlling the institutions that are supposed to protect society from them. You are now part of this story. By learning about the Harpe brothers and their connections, you have acquired knowledge that certain people prefer to keep hidden. By understanding the scope and longevity of the criminal networks that supported them, you have gained insight into aspects of American society that most people never see. This knowledge comes with responsibilities and dangers that you need to understand. The people who buried this story in the first place are still out there. Their organizational descendants still have the capability to ensure that certain information doesn't spread, and that certain people don't ask inconvenient questions. They still have the motivation to protect secrets that could expose their activities and threaten their power. You now know things that they don't want you to know. You now see patterns that they spend considerable effort to keep hidden. You now understand connections that they have worked for centuries to obscure. What you do with this knowledge is up to you, but you should understand that you are no longer just an observer. You are no longer just someone learning about historical events that have no relevance to the present day. You are now someone who possesses information that powerful people consider dangerous. The Harpe brothers are long dead, but the system that created them is still alive. It's still growing, it's still adapting to new conditions and new opportunities. It's still eliminating people who threaten its interests.